we've got another video on this topic, guys. I'm going to summarize what we learned from that video right here at the beginning, but this isn't my full treatment of the subject. This is just part me giving a clarification, okay? So let me bring you guys up to speed on what happened here. Now, I believe there are genuinely good things in the slavery video that I already did, okay? There's definitely some good stuff in there. And so I didn't want to delete it. It's not full of errors or anything like that. But I did make one key mistake in that video that I want to try and correct here, okay? First, I said that racially motivated slavery is never acceptable or praised by God. And I said that oftentimes we have things in the Bible that are prescriptive or descriptive. And my contention was that slavery in the Old Testament was descriptive. God was telling them how to do this, even though he wasn't saying they should do it, okay? We read Leviticus 25, and I talked about indentured servitude, and I said indentured servitude is different from racially motivated slavery, right? I said that those are very, very different ideas, okay? And I talked about the year of Jubilee. Now, how the slaves were released every year at the year of Jubilee, every 7 years, okay? I talked about that. Now, I implied that all Old Testament or biblical slavery is indentured servitude and that all slaves are released at the year of Jubilee. That isn't true. So I'm going to have to go into more detail on that here in a second. I also said that slavery is not God's best, and I compared to Matthew 19 on the topic of divorce, where Jesus explicitly says, because of your hardness of hearts, God allowed you to divorce your wife. But that's not how it was supposed to be. And I applied the same logic to slavery, even though we don't have an explicit biblical statement to that nature. I think it's of the same kind or same thought. I noted that the same logic applies. And then I said it is not Christianity's first principle to right all of the wrongs of this world, okay? Instead, Christianity's first principle is to unite us back to God, okay? So that's a summary of what I essentially said in the first video. But I said this at the end. It is not racial slavery. It is economic slavery, okay? Now, here were the two comments that got me. Nick Bracing came in, and he said, hey, good job on trying to address a tough issue, but you're wrong, okay? And he explicitly called me out on this point that I want to put down later. I said in the video, slavery was not forced, but it was indentured servitude. He says, you said this and I nearly fell out of my chair. Prisoners of war were made chattel slaves. You could be born into slavery. You could be sold into slavery. How could you say this? I have no idea. The Bible is really clear on this. I think you must be, again, conflating debt or indentured servitude with slavery. It's the only thing I could think you might mean, but it's wrong, okay? And I started looking into what he was saying. I think he's right. I made a mistake there, okay? This person also, Christopher Voss Savant, said, sorry, the Bible does in fact support racial slavery. You may purchase slaves from other nations. These slaves from other nations became permanent slaves and were considered as property. And Christopher Voss Savant at this point is correct as well. And so these two individuals called me out on my video. And so I thought it was very, very important to do a follow-up, okay? And so that's what tonight is, okay? Now, I will say that I think the content of my video as a whole is correct and right and does not represent, anything wrong in terms of slavery. But I made a crucial error while reading one of the verses that I want to correct tonight, okay? And that crucial error has to do with Leviticus 25, verses 44 to 46. We'll read it here in a second. I implied in the video that indentured servitude and the year of Jubilee were both available to all slaves, and that is absolutely not true. In the year of Jubilee and indentured servitude were for Israel slaves, okay? It was for people who were of Israel in terms of their background, okay? This is not the case for slaves from other nations, okay? And so I needed to make that clarification. Now, before I jump into this, I do want to note this. There's also a difference between Old Testament slavery and New Testament slavery, okay? And I failed to note this difference in the last video as well. In Old Testament slavery, it's very, very clear that most of that looks like indentured servitude. This is a quote from Doug Wilson. In the Hebrew Republic, slavery was akin to what we would call indentured servitude. This is Doug Wilson, okay? The only permanent slaves were foreigners, all right? Now, that's a detail that I failed to note last time. I didn't note that permanent slaves were foreigners, Okay, I didn't note that foreigners took a status of permanent slavery, and I needed to. Okay, or Hebrews who voluntarily submitted themselves to a more permanent servile status. So that's a mistake I made last time. Now, the New Testament slavery is Greco-Roman pagan slavery, and that's what Doug Wilson notes here. Pagan from top to bottom, front to back, the slaves having virtually no recognized rights at all. So there's a difference between slavery as it was represented in the Old Testament and slavery as it was represented in the New Testament. Slavery in the New Testament was not divinely sanctioned. It was explicitly established by the Romans, and it was pagan through and through, and people were treated like absolute animals, okay? But in the Old Testament, it was indentured servitude for Israelites and then permanent slavery for foreigners. And that's what we need to deal with today, okay? Now, here's our tough passage in Leviticus 25, 44 to 46. Your male and female slaves are to come from the nations around you. From them you may buy slaves. You may also buy some of the temporary residents living among you and members of their clans born in your country, and they will become your property. You can bequeath them to your children as inherited property, and you can make them slaves for life, but you must not rule over your fellow Israelites ruthlessly. So there is the difference. And the contention from both of the people who called me out in the chat was, this is chattel slavery, and it's racist because you're supposed to treat Israelite slaves differently than slaves from other nations. Okay, so those are the two contentions. You can buy slaves from the nations, clans, etc. They're your property. You can bequeath them, but not the case for your Israelites. So that's where the charge of, no, it was racially motivated slavery comes from. Verses 44 to 46. And interestingly, we read these verses last time, but I missed this crucial aspect of the passage and what its implications were. Okay? Now, this is such a strong statement that it has led some Bible commentators to actually claim that this passage is a redaction and it's completely out of line with the rest of the Old Testament. Right here is from the commentary called OTL. Listen to what they say. The laws of the year of release do not apply to the aliens dwelling in the land and their descendants. This is shocking when compared to the basic rule in Leviticus 19:33, which says when a foreigner resides among you in your land, do not mistreat them. Okay? So they say it's shocking. Okay? Disadvantaged status of the resident alien becomes even more incomprehensible. And later on, they make this claim. This is how bad they think it is. Or has a bit of anti-divine praxis entered into the law of release purely by accident through the inattention of a redactor? What do they mean? They mean they think this passage is so out of step with the rest of the Old Testament, they think it was inserted into the text at a later date. That's how bad they think this passage is. It must have been inserted into the text at a later date. Now, I don't think that option is available to the majority of conservative Christians who stand for sola scriptura, the inerrancy of Scripture, etc. But some commentators have gone that far to say this has been inserted at a later date because it's so out of step with the rest of the Old Testament. Okay? But it's a tough passage, I have to admit. Leviticus 25, 44 to 46 is a tough passage. Now, what I want to do is make an attempt at Christian harmonization of this passage tonight. Okay? That's what I want to do. A Christian attempt at harmonization. Just saying, well, it's a redactor, it's not original, I don't think is right. Now, where is the contrast? That's, I think, where the question lies. Some people would say the contrast is in verse 46, where explicitly you can do certain things to them, but you must not rule over your fellow Israelites ruthlessly. Some have said that implies that you can rule over the foreign slaves ruthlessly, even if you can't rule over the fellow Israelites ruthlessly. Okay? Well, that's contrasted with Job 31, 13 to 15. If I have denied justice to any of my servants, whether male or female, when they had a grievance against me, what will I do when God confronts me? What will I answer when called to account? Did he who made me in the womb make them? Did not the same one form us from within both of our mothers? So here you can see in Job, we've got this principle of no, we need equity. You know, people need to be treated correctly and properly, irrespective of their background. So I don't think the contrast in the text comes from the fact that you're allowed to treat non-Israelite slaves poorly. I don't think that's what it's teaching. Okay, so that's the first comment. The second has to do with chattel slavery, just as was claimed by, again, the two people who had called me out. Now, to this, Doug Wilson notes two passages, one in the New Testament and one in the Old Testament. The New Testament explicitly condemns slave trading, right here. For the sexually immoral, for those practicing homosexuality, for slave traders and liars and perjurers, and for whatever else is contrary to sound doctrine. So right here in 1 Timothy 1:10, you can see slave trading is explicitly forbidden. Now, that means that you might own slaves to start, but you weren't going to trade them like property. Now, that's the New Testament. Does the Old Testament teach that? Not quite, but the Old Testament condemns kidnapping, which is related to slavery. Anyone who kidnaps someone is to be put to death, whether the victim has been sold or is still in the kidnapper's possession. So the Old Testament, although it doesn't condemn chattel slavery as is, does condemn kidnapping, which is a large basis on which, for example, American slavery was based. And the New Testament condemns slave trading outright. So both of those are condemned, and Wilson essentially says this means that if you were to implement biblical principles consistently, slavery would be phased out eventually. It would kind of fall away. It wouldn't persist, okay? So that's the contention there. Even if that's the case, even if we would grant that, there's one tough thing, and that is this question that I've noted right here. Why is there a disparity between Israel and the nations? And is this racist? Because that's the final contention, okay? Why do you get to treat Israelite slaves differently than slaves from the nations? Why the disparity, and is this racist? Now, to this topic, I've found three essential options, okay? And I'm just going to summarize them for you. Option number one, I like the least, but I want to reveal it to you. This one says, hey, if you notice, although it says here, yes, you treat them differently, those slaves differently, they stated essentially, well, if you go in the Old Testament, this is what you were supposed to do with your slave. Then his master must take him before the judges. He shall take him to the door of the doorpost and pierce his ear with an awl. Then he will be his servant for life. And he's saying, look, now it says to keep a slave permanently, you have to pierce their ear with an awl. And then they compare that to Deuteronomy 15:17. Then take an awl and push it through his earlobe into the door. He will become your servant for life. Do this the same thing with your female servant. He says, look, you're supposed to pierce their ear with an awl. Well, he compares that to Leviticus 19 and verse 26. And here's what he says. He says, Leviticus 19:26-28 says this, do not eat any meat with the blood still in it. Do not practice divination or seek omens. Do not cut the hair of the sides of your head or clip off the edges of your beard. Do not cut your bodies for the dead or put tattoo marks on yourselves. I am the Lord. His argument is, because it explicitly says not to cut your bodies for the dead or put marks on yourselves, that it's condemning Israelites to participate in the ear-awl driving activity. And so, if they would have listened to all the Old Testament, they would have realized, well, I'm supposed to pierce your ear with an awl, but I can't because that violates other Old Testament sanctions. Therefore, I guess I'm not supposed to have slaves. I'm sorry. I appreciate his his rather unique reading of the text, but it feels like special pleading, and he's trying to make excuses for the passage. So I don't like that rendering. I don't like that option. I instead prefer a combination of options 2 and 3. Option 2 essentially says this, and this comes from Warren Wiersbe. He says, God was trying with the sanctions to eliminate slavery amongst Israelites first, and then only once slavery was eliminated amongst Israelites was he going to proceed to eliminate it among Gentiles as well. Okay? Right here, Wiersbe says God had to eliminate slavery in Israel before he could deal with it in Gentile nations. Had the Jews treated one another as the law required, Israel would have been a testimony to Gentile nations of the grace and kindness. Instead, Israel failed to obey, and eventually they became slaves themselves, as recorded in the book of Judges. He's saying, look, God was trying to purge it amongst Israel first. He would have moved on to the Gentiles afterwards, but we never got that far. Okay, I can kind of see where he's going, but I don't think that's the whole story. Point number 3, option number 3, I think tells the other half of the story. And this has to do with a redemptive historical argument. The argument is essentially this, okay? The purpose of Israel in the Old Testament was to preserve a special and unique nation so that they could produce the Messiah, okay? And because that was God's primary goal in the Old Testament, is to preserve a special and unique nation so they could preserve the Messiah, his purpose was not to cause them to be a completely slaveless nation. His purpose instead was to keep them unique and special and separate. And we see that with many of the Old Testament laws. Many of the restrictions that are placed upon Israel are not meant for everyone, but meant for Israel because they are meant to be a unique and special nation. And God was continuing to do that with this restriction. Hey, you can't make Israelites your permanent slaves like you can with the slaves from the rest of the nations because it's important that you guys stay special and unique. You need to treat them special and unique. Now, I think that makes a lot of sense given what we know about the arc of the Old Testament as the whole. But the salvation historical argument or redemptive historical argument is a twofold argument. It's not just one. Not only did God want to keep Israel unique, but also he had already redeemed them out of slavery from Egypt. And so it was completely or improper to make them slaves again when God has purchased them from Egypt. So it becomes not a case of God wanting to treat his people purposefully better than everyone else, but rather that he has already purchased them so they can't be made slaves. Even though slavery in general continues to exist, you'll not do so with the Israelites because they're my people, right? I think that makes a lot of sense when you combine these two redemptive historical emphases, okay? Under the Old Covenant, God wanted to keep his nation unique and separate from other nations, so they had different rules, some of which benefited them and some of which didn't, right? They also had restrictions placed upon them that weren't placed upon Gentiles, so that's important to recognize. And not only that, he had purchased them from slavery, so it's improper to make them slaves again. Combine that with the concept of God eliminating slavery amongst the Jews before he seeks to do so amongst the Gentiles, and I think you have a fairly cogent argument, right? Final thoughts here, and this comes from the Cornerstone Commentary, followed up by Douglas Wilson. I'm just going to read it. In the Cornerstone Commentary, it says this: slavery was common among all of Israel's neighbors, but the Old Testament laws served to curb some of the abuses this practice could entail. They do not establish slavery, but recognize its existence and seek to regulate it. That's a point I made in the last video, okay? All people are created in God's image and are worthy of respect and dignity, so some of the laws needed to address the real situation, the fact that slavery existed, rather than the ideal, that there should be no slaves at all. And Paul carries this concept forward yet another step, not only in saying there should be no ultimate distinction between Israelites and non-Israelites, but that there should be no difference at all in an equitable society between slave and free. And this is Galatians 3:28. There is therefore no Jew nor Gentile, neither slave nor free, nor male nor female. You're all one in Christ. Okay? So I think that's an important concept as well. So that's from the Cornerstone Commentary, and I have a final quote from Doug Wilson that I think applies to this topic. The laws on slavery in the Old Testament begin with manumission or release from slavery in view, and were given to a people who themselves had been freed from bondage in Egypt. The temporary nature of Hebraic slavery was built into it as a design feature. Okay? So yes, there is a disparity in the Old Testament between how Jews were treated when it came to slavery and how the rest of the nations were. But once you take into salvation historical principles and you take into account the fact that God is working on Israel at the time, and that will eventually flesh itself out in God going to all the nations and eliminating slavery across the board, I think it makes logical sense that he didn't cause the elimination of slavery in Israel to be of primary concern. Okay? Add this discussion tonight to what I talked about on our other video on the topic of slavery, and I think you get a good comprehensive view of biblical slavery that isn't biased or colored. I'm absolutely owning the fact that there is a disparity between Israel and the nations, and I don't think it's racist because God has redemptive historical purposes and reasons for why he wants us to treat Israelite slaves different in the Old Testament. And again, all of this finally works itself out in the New Testament, God's plan from the beginning. There is neither Jew nor Gentile, neither slave nor free, nor is there male and female. You're all one in Christ. Okay, so that summarizes the ideas. Hey guys, Pastor Tanner here. I hope you liked that video, and if you did, would you please consider hitting the like and subscribe buttons? It helps us very much. In addition, we've got 2 links down in our description below to both our Twitch and our Discord if you're interested in getting more involved in our community. We'd love to see you there. Take care. God bless. Bye now.